Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Eric Heinze, a professor of law and humanities at Queen Mary University of London. He's the author of multiple books, the most recent being Coming Clean, The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left, which we'll be talking about today. Eric Heinze, welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael. It's very good to be with you.
So I wanted to start with what I feel like is a pretty important term as a social scientist. I like to start with defining my terms. So critical theory. That's a term that I think has taken on a lot of different meanings in recent times. So what's your kind of working definition of it?
Well, actually, I think it's always had lots of different meanings for at least certainly for decades, for the better part of a century. There have been different strands of thought, usually recognized as progressive thought, going broadly under the name of critical theory. But the one thing I avoid in the book is trying to give it any kind of overarching definition. Instead, my approach is simply to try to identify what I think have been particularly influential strands of critical theory in recent decades.
One of the things that drew me to your book right from the title is I'm fascinated with sort of the history of this. I've actually done a little bit of reading on the Frankfurt School, maybe just enough to make me dangerous. I don't know. But it seems to me that's kind of where this came from, starting in the late 1930s. I'm thinking of, what's his name? Max Horkheimer essay, maybe. But it seems to me, until the 60s and the 70s that it really became a big thing. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why that sort of lag time before it really hit big, and why do you feel like it became sort of more and more important in left-wing circles?
Well, I guess if we want to do a bit of a potted history, you could say pretty much that it begins really not in the 1930s, but in the 19th century, essentially with Karl Marx, and maybe with certain lines of Hegelian thinking. But nevertheless, you're right that Max Horkheimer in the 1930s, right, one of the founders of the Frankfurt School, does coin the phrase, working with a group of intellectuals at the time when at least kind of orthodox Marxism is not holding water. You have more and more people casting doubt that any kind of literal or mechanical understanding of Marx can really still be carried forward into the 20th century. Because if we take Marx very literally, then too much of what he had more or less predicted did not seem to be happening by the 1930s. Although certainly these people thought that capitalism still brought with it, a lot of oppression, a lot of social problems. And so, yes, so you're right. In the 1930s, then we do get this new school forming. It's trying to be less mechanical than, again, some schools of Marxism had become. Again, Marxism had reduced everything very much to relations of economic production, whereas these newer thinkers wanted to look at society from a number of different angles. again, still with a focus on the ills of capitalism, but again, trying maybe to avoid what reductionist understandings. Now, I think what then happens, but again, you're right that still by the 1930s, this is small groups of people. This is far from being a kind of a global movement. I think what changes is, of course, first of all, World War II, and particularly someone like Hannah Arendt, who famously did this very searching, very probing study of 20th century totalitarianism, fascism, right? Looking at both far left and far right forms and trying to dig up the deeper patterns, right, of totalitarian or fascist movements. This was certainly very influential. But then, right, and this is published after World War II, very much as a response to World War II. So World War II is crucial. And then, of course, by the time we get into the 1950s, 1960s, we're moving into the era of decolonization, of the American civil rights movement, of new waves of feminism, indeed later on of gay rights, LGBTQ rights. Yeah. And so with all of these successive waves of thought, we see kind of broadly progressive politics moving in all sorts of directions. And so I think we can meaningfully talk about critical theory, which does weave through them certain ideas which do connect them loosely. So again, I don't try to offer any overarching definition. I don't think that's possible or useful. But instead, I just try to look at some of the recurring trends.
One of the things you mentioned in the book a number of times is what you call the radical critique of Western liberal democracy. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that?
Yeah. The radical critique of Western liberal democracy, again, a kind of umbrella term. It's not one critique, right? I think it takes many forms, but its guiding idea is that Western civilization over several centuries has been responsible for misery, whatever achievements, right? Critical theorists do not necessarily reject certain achievements of Western civilization, but refuse to allow those to eclipse certain atrocities, mass injustices, again, accumulated over several centuries, including problems of exploitative capitalism, militarism, imperialism, colonialism, racism, patriarchy, heteronormativity. Now, most critical theorists will gladly concede that these are not exclusively Western phenomena, right? We find different versions of them in many civilizations throughout history, but nevertheless, they see these ills as having been very prominent. Again, having given rise to mass systemic or structural injustice, over arguably several centuries, in ways that they argue continue to shape Western civilization and continue to characterize much of what we would refer to as injustice in the West and beyond, and outside of the West, in places where the West has nevertheless exerted influence. So this is what I would, again, in an umbrella sort of way, describe as the radical critique of Western liberal democracy.
I feel like almost everyone would say, at least to a certain extent, yes, there have been some problems. Capitalism, Western democracy is not perfect. But it seems to me that what makes this critique really radical isn't maybe just the critique itself, but how it's applied. At one point in the book, you write that this isn't just a point of view. It's a precondition for any legitimate point of view. And that seems like a really big deal to me. And I'm hoping you can kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think we can put this pretty simply, right? I think we can imagine easy examples, right? So say, for example, that some historian decides to write a book about, I don't know, let's say economic, social, and political conditions in 19th and early 20th century America. Yeah. But doesn't mention anything about slavery
Right.
or Jim Crow, or indeed patriarchy, right? This would be considered beyond incorrect, beyond deficient, right? It would be considered incompetent,
Yeah.
right? In fact, it probably wouldn't be published, right? I mean, maybe it would be, again, if we're focusing on some very arcane detail where those are just not relevant. But I mean a historian who would purport to do a general history, right, of 19th and much of 20th century America, and just not mention those things, right? And so that wouldn't just be seen as, a mistake that some reviewer might happen to point out, right? It would just fundamentally scupper the whole project. And rightly so. And rightly so. It would be a very strange book. Although I think we can say that books like coming close to that have not been unknown in earlier generations.
And so another concept that's linked into this is you talk about this sort of two-step process. You call it memory politics. And this is a big deal because, you certainly think it's a big deal because you say it's the left's most powerful contribution to today's world. It doesn't get much bigger than that. So I think we really need to get into what memory politics is and why it matters so much.
Yes. And I argue that memory politics, or a certain understanding of historical memory, is the West's greatest achievement, as opposed to any particular election that was won or policy that was implemented. I argue that this is the left's greatest achievement because fundamentally the left has defined our debates and therefore our conceptions of what justice is and of what injustice is, right? As I suggest in the book, you go back a few centuries, maybe 7 or 8 centuries, things like justice and injustice were understood very, very differently. My point is not, to be absolutely clear, my point is not that everyone has now shifted to a left-wing point of view. Obviously, we know that's not true. But rather, it is the left that has fundamentally defined the kind of debates that we have, what we consider important to debate about when we're debating about justice and injustice. And so you're right. I try to pin this down to what I call the 2 steps of memory politics. Step 1 is obvious enough, right? Namely that before we can talk about history or memory, we have to try to agree on some sort of historical record, right? Some record of slavery or Jim Crow or colonialism or women's subordination or what have you, right? Or capitalism, right? So we have to come up with somewhere, and we know that even at that step 1, you can have pretty fierce debates, but nevertheless, we often manage, right? Let's face it, we might have terrible disagreements about things like slavery or Jim Crow, but very few people are going to deny that there's any record at all, right? So that's step 1, is just trying to agree on some kind of historical record and knowing that it's always open to revision. The crucial step is step 2. And again, I think very, very specific to leftist understandings of history, at least in the forms that, that we've witnessed, over the past century or so. Step 2 means that it's not enough for these histories simply to remain locked up in textbooks and lecture halls and seminar rooms. History for progressives, for critical theorists, is not just an academic exercise, right? Step 2 is that once we've agreed on some sort of historical record, it is then not only a possibility, but a duty to disseminate this knowledge to the broadest possible public through film, right, cinema, documentaries, radio, newspapers, training programs, special commemorative events, museum exhibitions, right? And that this has to be done constantly, right? And so, we look on just about any university campus in the West today, rarely is it considered to be enough simply to discuss these things in the classroom and then, leave tidily after the bell is rung, right after the hour is open. In as many ways, that's just kind of the start, right? What then really matters are all sorts of other events, which may be nominally extracurricular but are seen as essential. But again, it has to then further the step 2 of memory politics needs even going beyond the campus. Again, it has to get into everybody's living room. These understandings of history, these critical, or what I call collectively self-critical understandings of history. And that is crucial. This is part of what I'm calling the left's most important achievement, namely that the left has not simply redefined concepts of justice and how we talk about them, but history itself, right? We go back a few generations, history meant the high deeds of great men, right? We would start with Alexander the Great and then, skip over to Julius Caesar, then, I don't know, maybe Charlemagne, and then, who knows, William Pitt or Thomas
Napoleon
Jefferson.
In there, absolutely, yeah.
Right, the whole, the whole roll call, right? And that was history, and the battlefields and all of this, right? And to be clear, I'm not saying that critical theorists have simply set aside that history. I think that would be an oversimplification. But critical theorists, progressives, have fundamentally redefined what we mean by history, insisting that we have to tell the untold stories, right? That history has to consist crucially also of the untold stories of history, right? So not just the George Washingtons and Thomas Jeffersons, but also the slaves who built the White House and worked on the plantations, right? And the women, right? Laboring at home or in factories or on farms, right? And sexual minorities or colonized peoples and so forth. Yeah. And again, this is fundamentally the work of leftists. Is one reason why we see people on the far right so virulently trying to extinguish these understandings of history and essentially go back to the high deeds of the great men and, usually particularly white men.
This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
This episode is brought to you by GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco. Get the most out of your vehicle with GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco original equipment. The only parts designed, engineered, tested, and backed by General Motors. You can find your perfect fit for most makes and models and choose from 3 tiers of parts, including GM OE or gold and silver aftermarket parts. Visit gmparts.com for more information.
I got to say, as a process, I kind of like it. It seems really pretty good to me because I feel like knowledge is just locked up in books. Really, it doesn't do a lot. And I do believe there's a potential for knowledge when it's released into the broader world. But my understanding, the problem potentially is when you're not honest with yourselves and you're calling out, say, the slave owners, the bad people on the other side. But you maybe gloss over some of the issues on your side. And that really is a big part of what you're getting at with what the left isn't coming clean about, right?
That's exactly it. In other words, right, if, again, the left's greatest achievement, or at least one of its very salient achievements, is to have fundamentally redefined history as collective self-scrutiny. Collective self-scrutiny, I mean, think about it. Even in today's world, how many societies outside of the West do this? And when did the West even do it? Up until very recently, right? Presenting history as fundamentally an exercise of mass collective self-scrutiny, where an entire society has to understand history as fundamentally an exercise in critique and holding a critical mirror to ourselves. You won't get this in Russia or China. And there are many other places where you still won't get it, right? And so again, I praise this. Like you, that's the society I want to live in. That for me is essential to anything that we could seriously call democracy. My criticism, therefore, is that, and again, this shocks many people on the left, that despite what they claim, the left has not done this with their own history. Or to be more specific, leftists are generally willing, critical theorists, progressive thinkers are generally willing to take the step one. Most progressives that you bump into today will say, yes, of course, our commitments to Stalin, they were wrong, or to Mao's Cultural Revolution, that was wrong, or to Pol Pot, or what have you, right? Even with Castro, we start getting a bit of wavering, right? But still, you'll see some sort of concessions there. So there is some kind of step one, the kind of the acknowledgement, the agreement on some sort of historical record of mass injustice, right? The problem is we see no step two. And again, step two is decisive. There is no progressive memory politics without step two. Again, it's not enough just to study colonialism or slavery or patriarchy in the lecture hall. This has to be disseminated to the broadest possible public. Now, one of the pillars of progressive thought, again, going back to Marx and certainly to the Frankfurt School, to people like Horkheimer, was that critique would always involve self-critique, right? And so we've come halfway with that. We end up today with a situation where self-critique means that progressives are telling all the rest of us how we have to do it, right? All the rest of us how we have to look at mass injustices going back over centuries of Western civilization. And again, I don't dispute that, right? I don't accept the far right attempts to simply scupper all of that. That's hideous. Rather, I'm saying that this position of we start with our own collective self-critique has been entirely absent, right? And again, as I say, many leftists are shocked or outraged when I say this because they really think that they do this, right? But we simply have to go to any college campus and see that they quite blatantly don't, right? So we'll get, Black History Day, Women's History Day, Gay History Day, what have you, and that's good. That's good. Again, I don't want to dismantle any of that, right? Where are critical theorists, progressive thinkers, leftists who believe in self-critique and say that self-critique is absolutely essential to critique? Where are they giving us a socialist history day or a leftist history day, right? Which would use the same technique. In other words, how did certain fundamental ideals become deployed to achieve deeply, massively, brutally unjust results? Because that is one of the key methods of critical theory, right? We look at liberal democracies, we look at Western civilization, we look at ideals such as equal opportunity or individual autonomy or civic equality, and we show how over centuries these ideals were used to bring about just the opposite, right? So we cite a case like Plessy versus Ferguson, right, which didn't simply create a regime of racial segregation. What it did was it actually drew on the language of equality, right, the liberal democratic language of equality in order to justify a regime of mass inequality, right? This is what critical theorists do. They're right to do it. Many of them do it very well. But the same thing happened in regimes that have enjoyed, at the very least, legitimacy, if not enthusiastic support for more than a century from the left, right? Regimes supported on the left in the name of certain liberationist or egalitarian or socialist ideals, where these ideals too of liberationism, of egalitarianism, of socialism were also systematically, pervasively reinterpreted, distorted, manipulated to bring about just the opposite results with untold millions of victims. And so one of the things I argue is that critical theorists are entirely right that history has to include the untold stories. The problem is that they have been preaching this to us, standing upon a massive high heap of untold stories, of stories that they also have not in any serious way engaged with, let alone disseminated. So this is one of the reasons I say in the book, I'm not anti-woke, right? I want much more. You might say, I want the other 50%. I want twice as much.
I think in response to that, it occurs to me that there are maybe two types of crits or leftists who might buy into this. There are some folks who I think just don't even recognize that they're not actually being self-critical, that what they think is self-criticism isn't really. And that's certainly not uncommon. But I think there are also folks who would say, okay, but the problem here is we're dealing with incredible millennia-long structural power imbalances. And if we just essentially start ceding ground by talking about the shortcomings of a tradition that we believe is generally good but has some problems, that's actually going to hurt the advance of the sort of liberationary potential of these movements. And so we're actually telling, if you will, kind of a noble lie or making a noble omission, basically. I'm wondering what you think about that.
If you gather together a room of progressives or leftists, critical theorists, whatever you want to call them, right, and you ask them about the concrete way forward, right, who should we vote for? Which policies should we endorse? You're not necessarily going to get a lot of agreement, and you probably witnessed this recently. Some wanted Bernie Sanders, some wanted Kamala Harris, some wanted Jill Stein, some wanted to overthrow the whole system, right? And, a couple of other names floating around, right? And so when it comes to the concrete nuts and bolts, you don't necessarily get a lot of agreement. Where you do get agreement is, well, fine, regardless of our preferred politicians or policies or platforms, where we essentially agree is that we simply have to be honest about our past. We simply have to have the discussion. You hear this phrase all the time. We have to start talking. We have to have the discussion. We have to be honest. We have to face up to, right? And then, right. So so the future is always hard because we know nothing about the future. So of course you're going to get lots of disagreement on policy, on strategy, right? But when it comes to facing the past, there is enormous agreement. In fact, I'm not sure why else critical theory exists when it comes to facing the past, except to teach us how to be honest with it, how to confront it as fundamentally rooted in or emerging out of mass injustice at many levels. So I'm only saying to critical theorists, fine, good, I approve of all of that, but then you have to be honest too, regardless of what your future strategies are, right? Or to put it very, very simply, I'll tell you very briefly what I like to call the tale of two lovers.
Okay.
Lover number one says, you always leave heaps of dirty dishes in the sink and your socks on the floor. Lover number two says, you always leave heaps of dirty dishes in the sink and your socks on the floor. But I admit that I leave the lights on too often and I've probably wasted too much money. Which one would you rather engage with?
Yeah, definitely too. Sure.
With which one are you likely to have a more honest and fruitful and constructive conversation? And notice, as to lover number two, the critique didn't disappear. Lover number two did not have to give up the critique. It's the same critique. What's changed is the context. And the context then changes everything.
How do you feel that, particularly in the American context, that the right has responded to the crits on the left and their project? It seems to me at times it's almost like a complete disavowal or an attempt to rewrite history. I'm thinking, like, for instance, in the Florida middle school history curriculum, now there's this implication in it that, slavery, yeah, bad, but kind of good because it helped Black people develop job skills. That seems like gobsmackingly stupid to me, and maybe I'm just straw manning this stuff, but I wanted to get your take.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, and that's kind of why I wrote the book, right? Because I think sometimes it becomes very hard for us to see our way out of these entrenched positions, these culture wars, these extremes just firing back and forth at each other, right? And that's why there is not a single page in my book where I tell any critical theorist to stop doing what they're doing. Right? So, right, it's the far right that tells them, stop the DEI, stop the queer theory, right? And so forth, right? Stop the attacks on capitalism. There's not a single sentence in my book where I urge anything like that. I say, keep going. In my other scholarly life, I'm very much a free speech activist. I think that, we have to have these discussions, right? So I'm saying, keep going. I don't tell anybody to stop doing any kind of progressive politics. Yeah. But what I am saying, again, is that you are right to hold liberal democracy to its own standards, which is why you would be right to hold yourselves to your own standards. Because, again, they don't. Step 2 of leftist memory politics of the left is entirely absent. There is none of it. And I am open to being proved otherwise. Take me to any college campus and show me the contrary. I don't know of a single one.
Do you feel
it's not even like 2%.
You have to go to like probably very right wing sort of schools, but yeah, I think your general point is
you see, but that's my point, Michael. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt.
No, please do. No, go ahead. No.
Again, I'm not talking about right wing people trashing it.
Right.
I'm talking about leftists doing the same self-critique that they insist that the rest of us do.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I guess I'm wondering, do you think it would be fair or accurate to say that there at least is this sort of mechanism, this critical theory mechanism on the left that's not being used very well or very honestly? But I could hear people on the left saying, well, you know what, at least we have this. And at least we, as opposed to those folks on the right who don't want to critically engage with the past in any way if it challenges built up structures of oppression and injustice. Or that's kind of me challenging my inner sort of far leftist. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. And one of the things I say at the very beginning of the book, I'm looking right now, it's page 8.
Okay.
So it's still in the introduction. And one of the things I say is that I'm going to focus on what I think are certain problems on the left, right? In part because that's the question everyone on the left is asking right now, right? Where have we gone wrong, right? It's almost the only discussion you hear. What needs to change? What do we need to do differently? I'm just jumping into that debate. But one of the things I say here, I'm going to quote you right from page 8.
Okay.
Right? For the most part, conservatives have come late to the table of historical responsibility, and many cannot find the door, right? In other words, I'm not so, my point is, although I'm focusing on the left, that doesn't mean that I'm giving anyone on the right a clean bill of health, right? It's built into the name conservative that a pervasively critical view of history would almost, would be wrong or superfluous or unnecessary. Right, it's probably right. Otherwise, because it's built into the name that we that it's good to fundamentally conserve existing traditions, institutions, practices. Right, which incidentally is why many conservatives don't see someone like Donald Trump as a conservative. He's not preserving. He's not conserving. He's dismantling the whole thing. Right. So absolutely, I do not. I'm quite clear that my criticisms of the left are not meant to be taken as praise for the right, and certainly not for the far right.
Do you think it's more difficult in the current political environment for folks on the left who might want to do this to find some sort of a receptive audience and spread the word than it might have been, say, 20, 30 years ago?
I think it could always have been done, and the sooner the better. I think maybe if there had been more of it 30 or 40 years ago, maybe the left wouldn't have some of the problems it has today. It would be much harder, certainly, to accuse the left of one-sidedness, of tribalism, of hypocrisy, of reductionism.
One of the kind of more recent examples are bringing us into sort of real world events. You discuss Noam Chomsky, among others, and the Ukraine war. And I thought that might be a good way to sort of bring some of this into sort of a real world current politics sort of context. So maybe you kind of explain how that ties in your view.
Yeah, this ties in a number of ways. After the initial Russian invasion of 2022, right, the one that's kind of still going on now, you ended up with a variety of voices on the left, which can be interpreted in several ways. Now, my first observation would be, again, if the left had taken seriously its own step 2 of memory politics, that step which it deems so important for the rest of us. Yeah. If it had done that, then whatever protests you're seeing now on university campuses, you would have seen 100 times that many against Putin. How many have you seen?
0,
right?
I can tell. Yeah.
So again, what does collective self-scrutiny mean? What does it mean to say we start from a position of self-scrutiny? It ends up meaning self-scrutiny is for you people and not for us. But again, let's get back to Chomsky. Yeah. So as I said, after the initial invasion, there was a range of voices on the left. Again, no consensus. This is not unusual. Right. So you had Chomsky pretty much taking a line that he's often taken, right? And he was certainly shocking even many people on the left, right? By saying that Ukraine should just capitulate. This is all the fault of the West. There's no point in fueling this war, etc. He was not the only one to say that, but, for such a prominent leading figure on the left to say it, I think at least some people on the left found to be embarrassing, although many, quite frankly, have simply ignored it or even found it rather fascinating. On the other hand, you have people like Judith Butler or Slavoj Žižek, also leading leftist figures, who took the opposite view, right? They were willing enough maybe to give some fault to the West, but they also squarely placed the blame on Putin, right? Chomsky kind of, condemns the invasion in a sentence or two. But again, Chomsky says that Ukraine has to fully capitulate and it's fundamentally the West's fault, right? So Zizek and Butler don't make it entirely 100% the West's fault, nor do they urge Ukraine to capitulate. And so superficially, we might say, aha, right? This proves that there's a great diversity of opinion on the left. You can't generalize. And, we have our internal disagreements and we do self-scrutinize and blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, maybe, right? I mean, on any part of the political spectrum, you can find disagreements about Ukraine. That's not unique to the left. But one of the things I argue in my book is we have to go much deeper. Right. So, yes, at a superficial level, it's true that someone like Chomsky on the one hand, and then Butler and Zizek on the other hand, seem to disagree. But what I'm saying is that you look to dig down deeper, none of them, and I've just named 3, we could add many more, and I do name others in my book, right? None of them, again, start from a position of, wait a minute. What was this regime over in Moscow that the left had supported for decades and supported admittedly at very different sorts of levels, right? Again, I'm not saying that everyone on the left during the Cold War was an ardent, Stalinist or supporter of the Soviet Union. Again, you had a range of views, but fundamentally it was a very strong current on the left during the Cold War to, at the very least, lend legitimacy to the Soviet Union, at the very least. And indeed, often varying levels of support. Right, this kind of Cold War evening out. Well, yes, of course, the Soviet Union has problems and China has problems, but the United States and the West, well, they also have problems. So it's almost as it all just, you had a very relativist discourse, that many on the left were very actively propagating, right? And so again, I ask, wait a minute, right? If we're going to be starting from a position of self-critique, where are any of these people, whether it's Chomsky or Butler or Zizek or any of the others, where are they starting from the point and seeing as decisive the starting point that the left for a good century did fundamentally have these commitments. How did these commitments come about? Again, what kind of liberationist and egalitarian or socialist discourses was the left largely endorsing, even while witnessing them being manipulated in precisely the ways that liberal democratic discourses or discourses of capitalism have been manipulated? None of them do this, as I show in my book. None of them.
I feel like, especially for folks who aren't familiar with the history of this, if you go back to, say, the 1930s, how many very prominent folks on the left were singing the praises of Joseph Stalin to the high heavens, when many of them actually even knew that there were horrific things going on, all to advance the cause of socialism. And I would think that if nothing else, just gaining an appreciation, engaging in this exercise of real, honest critical theory should develop a sort of sense of, I guess I'll call it, intellectual, ideological humility, maybe, that seems to me to be really sorely lacking on the left. On the right too, but we're talking about the left here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, 100%. Again, it's about step two. So don't just tell me, oh, yes, but I don't deny that Stalin committed X and Y, and oh, I don't deny that, Fidel Castro was not perfect. So forth. No, I don't want to hear that. That would sound as fatuous. That does sound as fatuous as someone saying, oh, well, I don't deny that there was slavery. So what? Right? So show us the step two if you have been expecting for decades now, and often rather successfully, all the rest of us to take step two. Where is that? Where are you taking your own initiative to actively disseminate this knowledge about how your ideals were systemically, brutally, oppressively manipulated, distorted, right, by regimes to which the left, again, at least lent legitimacy and often varying levels of affirmative support? Or, as I say in the final paragraph of my book, don't tell us, show us.
I wanted to ask you about that because it seems to me that I've read just enough political theory of the left to find myself oftentimes horrifically confused by the jargon. I stick with it, but I'm a political scientist. I'm a weird person, and so I wonder if critical theorists, the crits, as you sometimes call them, if they're actually they have the tools to do this sort of thing, even if they had the willingness. I guess the broader question is, what do you see this looking like if it were actually to happen?
I think they've always had the tools and perfectly developed. It's, as you say, it's the willingness to use them, which has been completely lacking. Because again, it would be a very, very similar kind of critique. And again, one which, going back to people like Horkheimer had already been underway, right? And I think that, for example, some early Bolsheviks would have been pushing for had they not all been shot.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, again, that this will always come out of a place of self-critique. Now, clearly, leftists understand how the rest of us have to do self-critique. So how could they not know how they should do it themselves, right? Right? And so again, I wouldn't look at you. So I say, as I said before, keep the Women's History Month, keep the Gay History Month, or the LGBTQ History Month, keep the Black History Month, or whatever, right? How about a Socialist History Month where you just do the same thing? Where you say, okay, and this is how our ideals too have been manipulated at the cost of millions of lives, because you need to know this too. Because we're not just concerned about one form of oppression or another form of oppression, we are concerned about oppression. Because the whole point of this exercise is to prevent history from repeating itself.
In the end, how optimistic are you that something like this can happen, that we can get sort of a critical mass of people on the left to say, well, yeah, we need to come clean. We need to do more of this and make it along the lines that you sort of describe. Do you think that that's plausible in the near term, or do you see any signs, maybe aside from obviously your book, and I agree with it, so there's two of us, but I mean, more than that?
Well, I'm certainly optimistic that it could happen, because as I said, the tools have been there for a long time, right? Again, to use your word, it's simply a question of will, right? of being willing to do what one for decades has been teaching everyone else to do. But having said that, whether I'm optimistic I'm optimistic that it can happen, whether I'm optimistic that it will happen, well, again, when I just did a little mini book tour in the United States, at one point in one of my stops, there was a kind of organized sabotage, right? So as soon as word had got out about my book, about a little event, right, apparently students, a small group of them, just kind of went onto Eventbrite and just kind of reserved every single ticket until it was sold out, so that when people who genuinely would have wanted, and this was months before, so that when people who genuinely would have wanted to attend made their way to the site, it said sold out, right? What happened, the event could never take place. On what basis did they do this? At the time that they did this, there was zero information about my book anywhere in the public domain. No one knew about it. There had not yet been any advertising or promotion. I had not yet written publicly about it. All that these boycotters had were a couple of sentences in a blurb, right, on the back cover of the book that was used to advertise the event. That's it. And that was now why? And I think this goes to the heart of the problem, which is that, right, my book says, or at least some of the promotional materials say, well, the left has been doing such and such, but the left also needs to come to terms with, Stalin and Mao and blah, blah, blah. And many on the left will say, oh, but, we've heard all this before. It's nothing new. All that Eric is going to do is just, keep digging up these histories and throwing them back in our face. And of course, you have read the book and you have seen, I don't do that at all. It's not a history book. Quite the contrary. I take those histories as pretty much done, or at least done by other people, right? And I go to step two. How will we use, again, but it's not a book about history, it's a book about memory politics, right? It's not a historical record, it's a book about what we do with history, right? And what I have noticed is that when I've given some speaking events that were not boycotted, when people actually did bother just to show up, and including in places that were quite leftist, right? Most of them were very receptive, including some really young people who are, I suspect would have identified themselves as maybe even far left, or very, at least, very solidly left, we might say, and when they just listened, they say, yeah, actually, this does make sense. And I think they saw, this might be something different. I can't speak for all of them. I didn't talk to everybody, but, I did have some people coming up to me and saying, yeah, this was interesting. They were, who knows? They hadn't read the book yet. Maybe they'll read it and they'll hate it, but at least they were willing to give it the time of day. They were willing to hear it out. And so that will be the dividing line, right? Those who are at least willing to let me finish my sentence, and those who will just read a couple of lines of a blurb and say, "Oh no, we've heard all that before." It's just whataboutery. We're not gonna go through all that again. That will be the dividing line, and we'll see if we can get more people past that, to some sort of level of what you and I might call intellect. Then maybe there's a chance.
Well, and I got to say that while a lot of books that have critical theory in the title or about it are just about unreadable for general readers, this isn't. It wasn't, like you said, kind of just rehashing the past. It really did something, at least for me, that was almost unique, is that it made me look at history and politics in a slightly different way. And that's such a cool thing. And so I really hope folks who are listening to this will check it out. It's a great book. And Eric Heinze, I'm just really glad you were able to take the time to talk with me today.
Well, Michael, it's been my absolute pleasure. And, thank you for this conversation. I've also learned a good deal from it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek's episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,